So because we relocated this wiring harness up a little bit, it moved these ground connectors so they no longer reach their original posts. So we're going to go ahead and lengthen those. There's a little bag in your electrical kit labeled ETR ground. This is going to give you all of those ground extenders. You're going to have 6 in here. You're only going to need 3 for this side. We give you an extra 3 just in case you need them on the other side. You usually don't, but we want you to have them just in case. So you want 1 of each color. So the yellow one's going to be your 12 gauge, and then you're going to have a blue one, which is your 14 gauge, and then like a pink color, which is going to be your 22. So I'm going to go ahead and set these 3 extra aside, put them back in my bag here. And then your actual ground wires coming through the van aren't going to have labels on them, so you just need to look at the sizes. So the largest one's going to be your 12, the middle one's going to be your 14, and then the smallest one's going to be your 22. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these metal ends off of all of these, strip the ends, and then connect my extenders via a crimp. So we'll kind of get into that and do some close-ups so you can see a little better. So you're going to take both these wires and you can kind of twist them together. And then feed it into your butt connector. You want to make sure all like the metal pieces go into the actual metal section of the butt connector, that none got kind of bunched up and stuck. Once they're in there well, you can take your crimping tool right on the edge there. Give it a little tug, make sure it's in there good. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the other 2 as well before I do my heat shrink. So on the driver's side of this van, these 2 leads actually from these 2 different grounding points are the same size wire. So we're going to use 2 of the yellow 12 gauge connectors and then 1 of the blue 16. And then our wires on the other side of the van are actually a little thinner, so we'll be able to use the 16 and then the 22s if we need them. Okay, so now that I have all my butt connectors crimped on, I'm going to go ahead and heat shrink them. You want to do it just until you see a tiny bit of adhesive coming out the back side. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay, so I went ahead and took off all the bolts from these ground connections, and then we're just going to go ahead and reattach these. So you just feed the ring terminal through the bolt here, and then just screw it back in. Okay, so now that we have our grounds reconnected, we're going to move on to our outlet plugs. So we're going to take this drop here in the back, and we're going to connect 2 of these pigtails. So we want to grab a red and a black. So this is basically going to allow us to take 2 leads from each of these wires here. So we're going to have 2 positives and 2 negatives that are going to plug into our 12-volt and USB outlets. So I'm going to go ahead and strip the wires here and then crimp them onto these butt connectors and then heat shrink them just like I did for the ground connections. We're going to do this same thing for all of the plug drops throughout the van. Okay, so we're going to move on to our fuse block connection. So I'm going to grab the EFBBT bag out of my electrical kit, and this is going to have our fuse block in there, as well as our riv nut with a ground connector, which we'll do in a little bit. It has all of your fuses. We'll put those in a little later, so set those aside. And it also has a number of these little dual lock pieces. This is what we're actually going to use to connect the fuse block to the metal of the van itself. So we'll put those all to the side for now and just use our fuse block here. So I'm going to go ahead and take the plastic cover off the front. And then we're gonna go through and take off the electrical tape off of our actual leads at the end of our harness. And then each of them are labeled, and we're gonna go through and connect all of them into the different ports of the fuse block. So all of the ports that are numbered going down, these are gonna be our positive ones. And then these kind of staggered ones at the top are gonna be our negative connections. I like to do mine in order, so like the top one corresponding with the top negative. All of our leads are also going to be labeled, so you can keep track of that as well. But yeah, we're going to do the same process that we did with the extenders for the grounds and the pigtails for the outlets. We're just going to strip the wires, crimp on our connectors, which I'll grab here in a second so you can see. And then you basically unscrew the little screw in the fuse block and then tighten it back down on top of the connector to keep it in place. Okay, so I've got my two sets of connectors here. One's going to be a 14 gauge, the blue ones, and then the yellow ones are going to be a 12 gauge. So we're going to go ahead and connect those to all of our leads coming off the driver's side and the passenger side. And just make sure you're matching up the 14 gauge with the 14 gauge connector and the 12 with the 12. And then after we have those all connected, heat shrunk, and secure, we'll connect them in with our fuse block. So I just went ahead and unwrapped the electrical tape that was holding these all together. And then I'm going to take one of my 12 gauge wires, you can tell again by the label, and it's also on the wire itself written, and then hook it into one of my 12 gauge connectors here. So I'm going to go ahead and strip my wire. Okay, I'm going to give it a little tug, it's nice and secure. So I'm going to go ahead and heat shrink that, and then do that with all the rest of the wires here. Okay, so I've crimped and heat shrunk all of my leads here for my driver's side harness. I've actually already connected them to my fuse block here as well, but we'll go through the passenger side and kind of show you how we did all that. The first thing I want to mention is I added some jewel lock onto the back of this fuse block here. This is what we're actually going to use to connect it to our van body. Basically, it's just like a really strong Velcro. They just lock in with one another. And then these white stickers just peel off to stick to both the fuse block, and then the other side will stick to the van body itself. You do want to clean your surface with a little bit of acetone just to make sure that adhesive sticks really well. And we're going to wait to actually attach it to the van body until we're putting up the trim piece. Just because that way we can make sure it lines up with the hole in the trim piece and it's nice and visible. So now we can move on to connecting our passenger side. So I'm going to go ahead and take one of my leads here. At this point you can decide what order you want things in. I try to keep them pretty organized, so my first three positive leads here are all of my plugs. So I have my B pillar, my C pillar, and my D pillar. And then I have my lights, and then my auxiliary drop. And then I keep my grounds, which are going to be up here. So all your negative leads, I keep them in a similar order so I can kind of keep track of where everything is. And then we'll go on later on, and there's a cover that goes over this fuse block that we can add labels to so it's easy to see, but for right now your labels are just going to be on your physical wires. So I'm going to grab one from this side. This is my auxiliary, so I'm actually going to put it right at the bottom here. So you just have to unscrew this screw a little bit, enough for this little U-shaped connector to slide underneath. There's a little like lock washer under there too. You want your spade connector to be underneath that. So once you've got that nice and in place, you can tighten your screw back down. And then once you have that nice and tight, you can connect the matching negative lead from this auxiliary 1 to your negative bus bar up here. So we're going to go through and do that for all of our passenger leads, and then we'll move on to connecting our actual fuse block to our negative ground and then to our positive battery connection. Okay, so now that we have all of our connections to our fuse block set, we're going to do our negative ground connection. So the fuse block has labels, so the negative is going to be the bolt at the top here, and the positive is going to be at the bottom. So the fuse block is going to sit in this general area here, kind of where the van starts to curve up, if that makes sense. And then we usually set our negative connection in this rib here. So remember that this whole area is that reinforced steel, so it's going to be pretty tricky to drill through. This is your last hole you're going to have to drill. So this section of the rib that captures the main ceiling rib is going to be reinforced. You can see up here there's two little spot welds. That kind of shows where that reinforcement starts. So you just want to drill back from that. And you can, there's your negative connection is going to be in a little bag in your electrical kit called ETR battery con. So this is going to have your positive connection, your breaker, and then your negative connection as well. So These are pretty bendable too. It's a stranded wire, so you can kind of hold it up there and see where you're gonna meet up with that connection. Ours we have drilled already, so I'm just gonna go ahead and open that up, and then we're gonna wanna take some kind of file or flapper wheel, whatever you've got on hand, and you wanna take away the paint surrounding that hole so we get a really good metal to metal connection for that ground. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and then we're gonna set a riv nut in there. In this location, this is the only time we're gonna set riv nut without doing rust preventative first. We'll go ahead and come back after the fact and do that to make sure, again, there's a good metal to metal connection. Okay, so now that we've got our riv nut set up here, I'm gonna go ahead and connect my negative ground wire. So we have the short little guy here, and then you're gonna have a 10mm bolt with a lock washer. It should have been threaded into your riv nut in your electrical kit. So I'm just gonna thread that on here and then thread it into my hole and tighten it down. Okay, so once that's nice and tight, we can do the same thing but on the fuse block here. So you just want to undo this nut and washer here, thread this onto the post, and then re-add on that nut and washer. Okay, so we're going to move on to the positive connection of our fuse block. So we're going to get the rest of the components out of this ERT back con bag. And then I also pulled our last two, or I guess 4 technically, pieces of dual lock out of our fuse block bag. So left in here we're going to have a short 4-gauge wire that's red, and then a longer red 4-gauge wire. And then we're gonna have some smaller size nuts and bolts here. So these are nuts and lock washers rather. So we give you a couple different sizes. The vans vary for the positive connection. So depending on your specific van can depend on what size you're gonna use. Make sure to check your manual. Each of the posts have different like amp ratings, fuses, things like that. So definitely check your manual to see which one you should be hooking into. The one we're gonna hook into is our smaller post, and it's got a 60 amp fuse on it, which is plenty for what's included in the kit. And then last, we're gonna have our breaker. So this is gonna be kind of the on-off switch for our whole system. So this is gonna allow us to keep everything off while we're still working, or if you leave the van for a while, you can turn everything off that way, or if you need to reset something, a fuse blew, something like that. So we're gonna do that. You have a couple ways that you can mount this. You can either use the short cable from your fuse block to the breaker and mount the breaker up towards the top of the B-pillar where our fuse block is, or you can mount the breaker down here towards the bottom right next to our post. That's what I'm gonna do. It's a little bit easier access for turning things on and off because we're gonna have that trim piece up on the top of the B-pillar. But whatever works best for your build, go for it. So the first thing we're gonna do is grab the nut that we're gonna use out of this. We're gonna use the slightly bigger one. So I'm gonna grab that and the lock washer. So these two here. And then my shorter cable. So we're gonna connect the cable to these posts on the side of the driver's seat. It's gonna be a little difficult to see, but I basically popped off this little plastic cover. And then there's this little like plastic piece here that houses the 2 posts. There's a larger post at the front and then a smaller post at the back. And there's a couple different ways that it allows you to route your wires from there. So we're going to do the one from the back here. So I'm going to go ahead and connect this shorter wire to that, attach my nut and my lock washer, and then we'll move on to connecting that to our actual breaker here. Okay, so we're going to connect our breaker here. So this is going to have 2 posts. There's one that's labeled aux and one that's labeled bat. So we're going to connect the battery one. There's going to be nuts and lock washers on these as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and take those off. And then you're going to want to make sure that this yellow tab is facing like flipped out, if that makes sense. This means our circuit's off. So we're going to leave it off for now while we're connecting into our main connection. And we're still doing a little bit of wiring throughout, so leaving it off is a good idea. And then we'll turn it back on when we're ready to test connections, plugs, that kind of a thing. I'm just going to hook that right on there and then re-thread my lock washer and my nut here. Okay, so now that I have my shorter positive connection run, I'm going to go ahead and attach my dual locks to the back of this breaker. I've already wiped this down with a little bit of acetone as well as this whole surface here, just to make sure this sticks really nicely. So I'm going to go ahead and stick it to the breaker first, and then we're going to want to stick it onto the back of this seat base. Notice that there's quite a few vents in here, so you just want to make sure you're not sticking on top of one of those vents because you're not going to get a very good contact point. And then you're also, this wire is pretty rigid, so do the best you can, but we're going to have the positive lead going up top that way. So I'm going to try and manipulate mine to mount so that that next post we're going to hook into is available to move upward, if that makes sense. Okay, so now that we have our positive connection made to our fuse block here, we're all done with this connection. The last thing to do is add our fuses. So you would have gotten a little bag of fuses in your bag with your actual fuse block. And these leads are all going to be labeled with the fuse that it's going to need. So you can go through and add all of those. This is also a really good time to label the actual front of your fuse block cover. You're not going to be able to see these labels on the wires once we have this trim piece up. So having everything labeled nice and neatly on the front here is going to help you out later down the line if you need to change one out. So I'm going to go ahead and add my fuses and labels, and then the last thing we need to do for the electrical is hook up our fan to the wiring harness. I'm going to wait on the light connections just in case we need to move those in and out of the ribs, so we'll do those when we do our panels later on. Okay, so I've added all of my fuses to my fuse block here. As you can see, you get 3 different sizes. You get a couple 5s, a couple 10s, and then a few 15s. So the 15s are going to be for all of your plugs, your USB and your 12 volt. The 10s are going to be for your fans, and then the 5s are going to be for your lights. And then you'll receive a few more 15s for your auxiliaries. Depending on what you wire those up to, you might want to change those fuse sizes depending on what product you're using and the amp pull it has. So we've left those out for now since we don't have ours plugged into anything. But yeah, and then your labels will be dependent on your specific build, but go ahead and label them accordingly. Pop your cover back on. And then the one thing I didn't mention earlier is these positive and negative wires you want going out to the side, just the way the cover is going to fit on. And there you have it. And then we're leaving this kind of loose for the moment, and we'll actually connect it with a dual lock when we do our paneling. Okay, so the last connection we need to make in our electrical is going to be our fan. So we have our rear fan connection here, and then we have 2 butt connectors that are going to be pre-connected to your fan already. So all we have to do is feed these into these connectors, crimp them, and then heat shrink. One thing you want to know is that the Max Air colored wires are a little funky. So the black is going to be your positive, and the white's going to be your negative. So be careful not to switch those around. It's easy to do because in the rest of the kit, the black's going to be your negative. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we'll move on to hush mat. One thing we want to do before we move on to the next step is do a really good clean of the van, get all the metal shavings out, do a good vacuum, because you don't want to be like trapping that behind the hush mat or the insulation.